Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Big Data, Big Dollars, Travel, Per Diem, and Mileage. I am Lindsay Falconer with Automation Services, the U.S. distributor of IDEA data analysis software and Caseware Monitor. I will be moderating this session, and I'll be handling the Q&A at the end. Our presenter today is Katrina Julia Gieselinchev from FitLife Creation. She successfully helps organizations identify operational inefficiencies through data analytics. In our previous webcast, she showed us where we should start implementing our data analysis to achieve the greatest return. In this webcast, we're going to take an in-depth look at the analysis and tests for travel, per diem, and mileage. If you have any questions, please type them in the questions box on the right hand of your screen. We'll answer most of them at the end of the webcast. To preempt your questions, yes, we will be recording the session. We will send out the recording and the slides in the next few days. They are also available as a handout also on the right side of your screen, so you can download the slides directly from there. We will not be offering CPE for this presentation, but we've got a lot of great information to get started with. So I'm going to turn this over to Katrina, and thank you guys for joining us.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Appreciate it so much again for this opportunity with automation. Hope everyone is having a fantastic day. And just for those of you that may be joining us for the first time, just some insight about some of my background, some companies served, and some partners as well. And what is today's session going to look like? I'm going to give you still some insight because I'm aware that some may be joining us for the first time, as well as providing a different video on an overview on big data and analytics. And I'd urge you to go back if you didn't listen to last week's or 2 weeks ago the session, because there's quite a bit of info there as well. Some insight into change is hard. And we'll be diving deep, as Lindsay mentioned, into travel, per diem, mileage, and those specifics, and then some targeted insight into data analysis there. Also be covering a questionable spending travel scheme that actually happened here in Atlanta, and just pointing and shedding some light on internal control weaknesses and gaps and things to think about. Also, I'll be pointing out some travel schemes specifically and some that I've uncovered and dealt with, and how you can structure tests, how data analysis can add value. I'll also be sharing some specific studies from Oversight, from IDEA, and some testing demos, as well as some strategy. And then just as a recap or a refresher from last time, just looking at some returns, looking at some cost and some assumptions as well, and considering opportunities. And then, as Lindsay mentioned, also feel free to put in questions for anything specific that piques your interest, and then a summary, of course. So Dilbert's back, and our consultant has been mining data all day. The results are quite shocking. According to the data, sales are always highest when I do this. So we often feel like we're pulling our teeth, pulling our hair, or in his case, pulling our mouth when we're digging through data or spreadsheets or softwares, or just getting a handle on sometimes how different companies have multiple different systems and components of decentralized data. So here's some insight into big data and analytics from the Harvard Business Review.
Big data, analytics. We've all heard the buzzwords, but what do they really mean? And how can they help your business? Let's start with definitions. Big data refers to the vast volumes and types of information that companies can now collect and process using increasingly high-tech systems. This comes from both internal sources within your company and external ones, customers, suppliers, and the broader market. It is both structured, such as customer purchase data from retail stores, and unstructured, such as internet search results, though all data has to be put into structured formats to be analyzed. Analytics is the use of math and statistics to derive meaning from data in order to make better business decisions. There are three kinds of analytics. Some are descriptive, for example, dashboards, scorecards, and alerts. They tell you what happened in the past, but not why it happened or what might change. Predictive analytics are more useful. They use past data to model future outcomes, perhaps indicating how customers will respond to a marketing promotion or how sales will be affected by certain market conditions. Even better are prescriptive analytics, which use techniques like optimization or A/B testing to advise managers and workers on how best to do their jobs. They might tell a TV salesman the right discount to offer, a web designer which type of ad will elicit more clicks, or a truck driver where to stop for gas. An ad will elicit more clicks, or a truck driver where to stop for gas.
I apologize. I'm not sure if my internet's having problems, but I would urge you, if you want to see the rest of that video, to go to the HBR site. And basically, it continues on to focus on the predictive components and just thinking about and using what you find in order to be able to, as it mentioned, predict whether it's more on the sales and operational side, as well as using, whether it was something negative. And negative is always, I look at it as something simply that you've learned from, and you realized you overlooked something, or you realized there was a gap there that you weren't aware of. And how can you not only plug up that gap or that internal control weakness, but how can you now use that information in a way to maximize sales or bring additional good to the company, get customer insight to develop more products, things like that as well. So as a refresher, I had here a change is hard and why data analysis. And looking at large amounts of data, proactive, being able to identify red flags faster, continuous improvement versus traditional audit. And traditional audit was implemented in the early 1900s, but there was so little digital data back then. It was very easy to look at so many amounts of paper. So it's kind of the the tension beyond or between what and how internal audit or external audit started, and that it served a purpose and the need then, but now with the exponential growing data, that it doesn't necessarily serve and align to that. And that's why IDEA exists. That's why all these other providers exist, because they fit in a true need that organizations need to increase assurance, to do all of these things, and to be proactive. So specifically in travel, I found a study with Oversight Systems. So this is very, very insightful. That 82% of fraud was committed by 5% of employees. So hyper-focused on a top-down based approach. 20% of travelers in this specific study were non-compliant with the policy. And 10% of travelers had at least one duplicate expense. And the hardest to control were the items beyond airfare, hotels, and car. So that would be your meals, your per diem, things of that nature. So just off of this and looking at this, I would encourage you to sort your data by employees and by employees that spend the most money. So designing your audit to be very, very strategic. Number two, designing your tests to be compliant with policy. So if you have a policy that states that you need to submit in expense reports within 10 days, when did they actually submit the expense report? If you have a policy, some companies I've worked with that they book travel 10 days in advance before the actual trip, like airfare, designing your test to make sure that they did that. Same thing for duplicates. Utilizing, I demoed that or showed that last time off of the toolbar with IDEA. basically running through a test by traveler, i.e. or employee, and then by duplicate. Did the employee submit a dollar amount for the exact same amount, and summarizing that. And that alone, those 3 tests alone could generate, just depending on what you find, 100% plus return on investment. I've definitely seen all of these schemes. And here's some insight, and I just was testing this earlier today too, and found that this, for some reason, the radio or the TV station took down the actual video. But I'm going to give you the insight into what happened here. So this was an actual case with Larry Lorenzo. He was working with the bosses out of the Office of Department of the Housing and Urban Development. This goes back to 2013. Federal workers went without a paycheck, and he cost taxpayers nearly $12,000 after using 3 government credit cards for personal charges. So I cannot tell you guys how many times I see credit cards being misused for 2 main reasons. One, the reconciliation on the back end is not being done. The vendors are not being looked at. And 2, there's no preventative controls put in on the front end to disallow certain vendors, to disallow, items being purchased over a certain dollar amount. So on both ends, by putting in preventative controls like dollar amounts and vendor types, you can work with your respective credit card vendor. I know Concur does this, to put certain blocks or certain dollar amounts, and or repeatedly looking at them on the back end. The HUD Inspector General found that he spent more than $7,000 in just 3 months at grocery stores. So, for example, if you ran a test at your organization by employee, by type of vendor, or even the vendor name, let's say these were like Kroger or Publix or whatever the case is, immediately if you saw $7,000 in a 3-month span, you would know, okay, ding, 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 there's something seriously wrong because we shouldn't have bills from Kroger and Publix to begin with. So that's another test you could run. And then he also had more than $2,000 for hotels. And another scheme kind of piggybacking off of this, I saw where people were billing for hotels in the same state that they live in, and they were also employees that didn't travel. So again, just determining what should be happening, what is actually happening, can shed some definite light. And in his case, he also had the cable bill. So maybe Comcast, DirecTV, whatever the case is. But again, that's a vendor you would not expect to see. And this is what happened in his case. He was convicted. He was convicted of misdemeanors and felonies, and also served 9 years probation. And in his case, he also had a drug issue. So what they recommended were regular audits for looking for credit card abuse, like some of the ones that I'm mentioning as well in this case. And then here's some more insight into specific schemes. So just abuse of travel expenses, looking at dollar amounts, as I mentioned, sorting by employee and by type. And so many times I've also seen, just exorbitant seminar fees, exorbitant dinners. Some companies that I worked for, had an alcohol limitation of, no more than 1 or 2 drinks per employee, one for expense purposes, but really more so for liability. Inappropriate vendors, so I mentioned, some of that. Another scheme that I uncovered, it was a client that, a real estate appraiser client here in Atlanta, and he said, hey, I just want you to take a quick glance and, look at this and tell me if you find anything. And ironically enough, he was considering adding a third partner to his business that lived in a different state. And I said, well, has he been generating the return off of sales that you expect him to generate? And 2, have you looked at, his expenses and looked at like his ethics, and things like that? And when I did this test, because he said, I just want you to look at inappropriate vendors and expenses, it turned out he had over a $2,000 bill when he had traveled to Atlanta on some business and to also meet with the owner to the Pink Pony, which was a quote-unquote adult entertainment place. And I, of course, advised the owner and said, I've helped people terminate people for a lot less than this. And if he's doing this as an employee, imagine what he's going to do as a partner. And because you're granting him that authority, and the owner, which can be very common with not only small businesses but also large companies, had a very just family-based and forgiveness-based towards people, often or sometimes to his own detriment. And he was still wanting to go ahead with the offer of partnership, despite the fact that he was the potential partner to be, was also requiring a relocation package of over $50,000 to pay off his credit card debt. So obviously from every angle, there was different warning signs that were going to show him that this was not a good decision, starting with the Pink Pony discovery. And a couple of weeks later, I stepped away from the client because, he didn't follow or listen to the guidance or want, in this particular instance, to face the fact that this employee had, at the end of the day, and to be partner, stolen $2,000 from him for something that was clearly not a business expense. I mentioned duplicate submissions, excessive mileage. So several schemes that I've seen with mileage. One test that I would recommend, and this can uncover the particular scheme I'm going to talk about, is sorting all of your mileage data by employee and by the dollar amounts that they submit, and then in IDEA or in any particular, Excel or any particular solution, you can then simply add another column that you divide that by the IRS approved rate that I believe is, still 55. Maybe it's gone up since the last time I looked. But then you can look and see what's the actual mileage that they drove. And I can tell you of a particular scheme in a $500 million company that I worked with. They had over 12 different employees and executives that had submitted well over 100,000 miles in a year. So, just making sure that you're testing that. And in that case, the COO was signing off on the mileage, but he wasn't paying attention to how much was happening, just in the midst of things, and not looking at what someone had reported. And then the other example in the operational overlap I have at the bottom was also that I ran a test in looking at what dates did someone report mileage compared to what days did they actually travel out of state. And in this particular example, there was a senior business development manager, or VP, that had, I verified the facts. I called the hotel to make sure he actually stayed. I confirmed with travel that he actually, flew on those dates before I reported anything. And it turned out that he had over-reported mileage of about $3,000, which of course then begs the question, well, if you're doing this and you're in a leadership role, what else are you possibly doing? And reported that to management, and they were very, very hesitant at approaching the situation. And it turned out that they finally did, with external audit also getting involved. And once they approached him, he bullied them into quitting. And what ended up happening was he quit, but then he actually ended up suing them for wrongful termination because they didn't confront the situation in a timely manner, and the attorneys actually advised them to settle. And so I share this not only to give you insight on the scheme, but I also share this with you to just give you insight on the repercussions of not confronting a situation and what can happen, and that it can also cost the company money beyond the fraud and the lawsuit, And what they settled for was a lot more than the fraud was. And, we didn't know there was also a potential kickback scheme, because it turned out that the one contract he had was a negative 15% gross margin project as well. So there were several different things going on there. The per diem overage. So on per diem, a couple of the tests and different things that you can run would be, looking at if your per diem is, $50 or $25 or whatever it is, making sure you don't have any anomalies outside of that, just comparing anything that's over. And also looking at, are you paying people that no longer work for you? So another scheme that was uncovered with another company, I ran a test on the per diem and all the per diem loads across all the employees. We were using a system called Comdata. So if you're doing per diem internally, and depending on the data that's being provided, you may want to consider switching over to a system like Comdata, because Comdata basically not only will list the employee, but will also list where the withdrawal happened and what ATM and what location, so that if anything ever happens, you have that data to prove to court, to prove to insurance, and to even get a subpoena from the bank with a picture of the employee, which is exactly what happened in this scheme. So I was running a per diem test of all the loads out of Comdata to the Active Directory list, which means I went to IT and asked them for all the employees that had been in the network and active on the company's network within the last 3 months. And before I ran the test, I compared that to the HR active listing of employees to make sure we weren't paying salaries to employees that didn't work for us anymore. So on the payroll side, so I'll talk about that in a second. So compared the per diem to the Active Directory list. And at that point, found 4 particular employees at one branch location in over 50 sites to the tune of about $10,000 in that 1 month. And the rest of the sites had maybe 500 or 1,000. And I said, well, it could be paperwork errors, it could be different things, but let me, make sure and let me knock those out and then focus my attention on this. And that's exactly what it was. It was paperwork errors or just timing of, getting them out of the system. But this one location with the 4 employees, when I called the ops manager, right away he said, oh, I know why you're calling. And I said to myself, I had a Scooby-Doo moment, like, ruh-roh, is he being honest? Or is he trying to stop me from going further? He said, well, these 4 employees, they don't work for us anymore, but I just gave their cards to these other 4 guys because it was easier. And I said, well, if that's the case, that's still a policy issue and HR is going to have to get involved, but I still need the logs. And what he didn't know, and this is why I point to Comdata, that I had the access on the back end that he never saw where those withdrawals happened. And so I pulled those 4 guys initially, and I looked at the withdrawals, and I said, this is really weird. Their per diem is $25, so again, comparing to policy, but the withdrawals are happening once a week for $200 to $500 at one location, or 2 locations that are within a 3-mile radius from the branch, and these are supposed to be travel cards. So long story short, what happened, this was a 6-year scheme. He not only listed ex-employees in his scheme, he also listed employees that never traveled. So the data wouldn't have discovered that until I then just took a quick snapshot of everyone that got per diem that year and sent it to 2 other managers to look at. And right away they called me and said, we have a problem. He stole close to $500,000 in $25 increments. So that's another component of looking at, again, on a per diem basis and what controls or systems you can get or put into place and test to get more insight. And then just looking at salaries or payments for ex-employees, as I mentioned, ask IT for an Active Directory list. First, compare that to what HR has and make sure first, before you do anything else, that you make sure those match 100%, because another scheme was, this is a global billion-dollar retailer that I worked with, was paying employees all around the globe salaries that no longer work for the company because people simply hadn't taken them out of the system. And they realized, 10 months later, and just decided to list it on their W-2s since they didn't want to go through issues or a potential lawsuit with getting the money back. And then once we cleaned up that data, what I would urge you to do is then use your active or HR listing, because now you know that it's correct, and compare it to any payments you've made within the company, be it travel, be it per diem, be it mileage, anything in any avenue, because at that point, if that person is an ex-employee, they shouldn't be getting payments from you. So some strategy insight. Summary of top spenders. You've heard me mention that a couple of times. The other summary I would urge you to do is a top vendor summary. So looking at just basically, it's a very top-down risk-based approach as opposed to random sampling, which again, you could miss all these schemes by random sampling. I'd also urge you to do a quarterly duplicate review. This is something that I know can be done, whether it's through continuous monitor, whether it's through using Smart Analyzer and recording a macro. You guys heard me talk about that last time, which is basically just designing the test, making sure it works, and then recording the macro to where it runs easily and you have valid exceptions. The duplicate review, ongoing review, late submissions. I mentioned the late submissions earlier, just comparing it to what your policy is. And then quarterly/ongoing spending overlap. So just really look at the operations of your company and look and see where you've provided some room for just inefficiencies. Like I mentioned, the mileage versus travel scheme, the per diem versus ghost. The other case, I didn't mention this, but this was another one. One company had fuel cards for employees out in the field, and they also had bulk fuel tanks. And when I looked at the combined spend, I said, guys, you're spending close to $1 million on, at the end of the day, fuel. And I promise you there's overlap or excessive spend because you're not only providing tanks on site, but then you also are providing them cards, which allows them access to get fuel on weekends, which is, in a lot of their cases, was not job related. So we ran a test on the overlap, and we ran a test by position, that by people that did not work jobs on weekends in this particular case. So we removed certain, anomaly, things that would be the norm. And we found over $200,000 in fraudulent spend that a guy and his wife had been using the card. And we also found substantial overlap and reduced quite a bit of just inefficiencies, and at the end of the day, money as well. So here's some quick insight on a travel sample with IDEA and some of the tests as well. And you can find these on automation.com. There's quite a bit of different ones.
Onto the menu itself. So I'm going to start off by doing a fairly simple test called delay in submission. The objective of this test is to look for people that delay reporting their expenses, maybe stacking them up for the end of the month, end of the quarter, or worse, end of the year, and identify the employees. And you get to determine how many days would be considered a delay. Choose the test from the menu item, and then select the file that you'd like to interrogate. Click Open. All of the tests in the auto solution packages are going to be dialogue driven. So each test that you click will show various dialogues. Simply answer the questions and you'll get a good solid result. For this test, I need to determine how many days would be considered a delay. I'm going to choose 15 days. I expect the employees to file their expense reports within 15 days of travel. And click OK. Select the return date. Each one of the tests that request input will have a dialog box and potentially a drop-down for you to choose the file from your data set. Next, As you can see, I have one instance where an employee took more than 15 days to submit their expense report. As with most of the tests in this module, you get a file output, and in the library, you'll actually get an export as an Excel spreadsheet of the result set.
So that's just one example of, very pointed focus, and you saw how quickly the arrival to exceptions was as well. So just as a recap from last time, just to look at value and look at different components, this was again based off 3% savings off of a $500 million company size, looking at spend, and then taking that 3 million and then again looking at, depending on where you are in your process, what angle you want to take, and some of these costs are different things. There's companies that do this all internally, so it's just really based on you into what approach and things that you can take, along with also the tests and different things that we've talked about within this presentation. So just as a recap, the suggested areas and approach: top spend by employee, by vendor, by client, comparison to ghost, and again, asterisk, make sure that you compare to the Active Directory list, because HR could basically have an inaccurate list, duplicate and late submissions, overlap, excessive mileage and excessive per diem, valid travel, and you saw, like, for example, in the solution, some of these tests were already there, and this is my recommended approach. Design your tests, estimate your results so that you can really see where you think value may come from. And this can also configure or be looked at, like if you know that you have really weak controls in a particular area or one person's handling it all, then you might estimate 10% of the account you may end up finding. My typical estimates are 1 to 3% of the account, and then sometimes we're pleasantly surprised, sometimes it's under, but it's just a good benchmark. Execute tests, filter your exceptions, and then focus on the exceptions, and then if there's return dollars or fraud, or you deal with that. But then the next step is kind of back to the video that it talked about in the beginning, is always think about how can we generate, or how can we also add value to this, especially when there's sales or different things involved as well. And we'll talk about more of that on the AR side. So summary: travel provides a great way to build value. It's a great proven concept. It's a great place to start. Significant overlap, typically in ops and travel. Evaluate and start with a clean slate. Talk to operations and finance. Yes, you may have the policy, but really get a handle on what goes on in operations so that you know more on how to design your tests. Big dollars reside in big data, and service providers, in essence, allow for increased clarity. So interested in more? Here's some more free webinars that we will be hosting on more insight in payroll. I covered a bit on payroll today with the ghost, so I'll talk in more detail about that and several other schemes and cases as well. And then the 23rd will be AP and expenses, cost of goods sold and inventory. And then the 30th is where we will dive deeper into AR, income, and expansion of markets and services, and contracts and margins. And with that, here's some more insight as well, in case you want insight into demos, insight into academies, insight into demos with IDEA or automation. And with that, that's all I had. Lindsay, do we have any questions?
We do, Katrina. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. The question that we have is from a CUA member, which is colleges and universities. And he's saying that at most colleges and universities, the credit card expenditures can be highly diverse. So what suggestions or ways do you have beyond limiting certain industries that can be used to find inappropriate or personal expenses on company cards?
So one, great question, but two, credit card expenses are always diverse. That's not anything new. They're always going to be diverse. They always are. But it's a matter of summarizing your data, and it's a matter of summarizing by type. So you heard in the video, it talked about structured data and unstructured. a lot of times data comes to us unstructured. But in order for you to make meaning out of data, you have to get clear on the data. And the way to do that is first to structure it yourself. So you've got to structure it by type. So like in the example or the fraud cases I gave, I would structure it by grocery. I would structure it by electronics. I would structure it by office supplies. I would structure it by meals and entertainment. Those are just some off the top. You know, if it's industry specific, like in education, it might be by labor. It might be by textbooks. You know, it might be by continuing ed. You know, you're going to know very quickly, and the way to do that is to either summarize or pivot, and pivot by just category type, like merchant type or vendor name. So going back to the summary, and by dollar amount. And you're going to very quickly see kind of what's going on, and then looking at, well, wait a minute, and comparing those numbers to budget. So let's say you see that one department spent, and then the other thing I would suggest is do it by department. Let's say one department spent, this is just one example of what I've seen, $100,000 on office supplies in 1 month. And everyone else's average is $5,000. You know, automatically that's going to scream to me that something's wrong. So step one is you've got to structure the data. Step two is you've got to look at operations, and then you've got to compare to see what's happening in one department or one vendor or one merchant or one type to the others. Like what I talked about with the ghost employees and the per diem case, I structured the data first aligning to policy, and then I compared, you heard in the story, I compared to what was going on to the other 50 locations. Always benchmark your data. And then it's going to become very clear to you that something's wrong. And then you can see, and again, don't cry wolf until you know and you verified information. But so hopefully that helps in structuring, operational, spend comparisons, implement benchmarks, and then narrow down your exceptions to where you're really maximizing your time and you've really eliminated what doesn't need to be reviewed. So hopefully that helps.
Yes, it does. Thank you, Katrina. We're a little over time, so I'm going to go ahead and cut us off here. As I mentioned prior, we did record this, so we will be sending this out in the email that you should receive tomorrow. And you also can download the slides. They're in the handouts on the right-hand side of your screen, and they'll be sent to you via email tomorrow as well. This is part 2 of an in-depth series, so please mark your calendars and make plans to join us next week at the same time as we take an in-depth look at payroll data. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please let us know, and have a great afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.